What if I told you that one of America's most powerful political dynasties built their fortune through business deals with Nazi Germany? We're talking about a family that produced 2 US presidents, a CIA director, and multiple governors, a dynasty worth over $60 million today. The Bush family name commands respect in boardrooms from Wall Street to Washington, but buried in dusty government archives and forgotten court documents lies a truth so explosive that it's been systematically ignored by mainstream historians for over 8 decades. Between 1933 and 1942, while American soldiers were dying on foreign battlefields fighting fascism, Prescott Bush, grandfather of President George W. Bush, was quietly making millions through companies that directly funded Hitler's war machine. We're not talking about innocent business deals that accidentally aided the enemy. These were deliberate, profitable partnerships that helped finance the Nazi regime's expansion across Europe. The numbers are staggering. Union Banking Corporation, Brown Brothers Harriman, the Hamburg America line, companies either owned or directed by Prescott Bush, generated tens of millions for Nazi industrial operations. When the US government finally seized these assets in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act, they discovered a financial web so complex and profitable that it would take decades to fully unravel. But here's what makes this story truly shocking. The Bush family never faced serious consequences. While thousands of American families lost sons and fathers fighting the Nazis, the Bushes quietly transferred their tainted wealth into new ventures. They used their wartime profits to build the political empire that would eventually put 2 family members in the White House. This isn't conspiracy theory. These are documented facts found in FBI files, congressional investigations, and federal court records. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight for 80 years, but the full scope of the Bush family's Nazi connections has never been told in complete detail. The question isn't whether these connections existed. The government's own documents prove they did. The real question is how a family built on blood money transformed themselves into American political royalty, and why this story has been buried so effectively that most Americans have never heard it. This is the story of the secret Nazi connection that funded a dynasty. Chapter 1. Dark Beginnings. The year was 1918, and 23-year-old Prescott Bush stood at a crossroads that would shape American political history for the next century. Fresh from military service in World War I, Bush faced the same challenge confronting thousands of returning veterans: how to build a meaningful civilian career in a rapidly changing economy. But unlike most veterans, Prescott had advantages that weren't immediately obvious to outside observers. His father, Samuel Prescott Bush, wasn't just any successful businessman. He was a man whose wartime government service had given him unprecedented access to America's most powerful industrial networks. During the war, Samuel Bush had served as chief of the Ordnance, Small Arms and Ammunition section of the War Industries Board. This wasn't a ceremonial position. Samuel Bush had essentially controlled American weapons production, deciding which companies received lucrative government contracts and which were excluded from the war profit bonanza. His office coordinated production between firms like Bethlehem Steel, DuPont, and Remington Arms, companies whose profits exploded during the war years. What most Americans didn't understand about the War Industries Board was how it functioned as both a patriotic service and a networking opportunity. The men who served in key positions during the war formed relationships that would define American business for decades afterward. They learned which companies were truly profitable, which industrial processes were most efficient, and most importantly, which foreign markets offered the greatest opportunities for expansion. Samuel Bush's government connections had shown him something that would prove crucial to his son's future success: the extraordinary profits available to American firms willing to invest in rebuilding war-torn European economies. German industry in particular offered remarkable opportunities. The country's industrial capacity had been damaged but not destroyed by the war. German engineers and workers retained their skills. German companies still controlled valuable patents and manufacturing processes. What Germany lacked was capital, and that's exactly what American investors could provide. When Prescott entered the financial world in the early 1920s, he brought with him not just his father's connections, but also his father's understanding of how government policy and private profit could intersect. Samuel had shown him that the most successful American businessmen were those who could anticipate government needs and position themselves accordingly. Prescott's first major break came in 1924 when he joined W.A. Harriman & Co., an investment banking firm founded by Averell Harriman, heir to the Union Pacific Railroad fortune. This wasn't just another Wall Street job. Harriman was already positioning itself as the premier American firm for European investments, particularly in Germany. Averell Harriman had recognized something that many other American investors missed. Germany's defeat in World War I had created unprecedented opportunities for foreign capital. German companies desperately needed investment to rebuild their operations, but punitive war reparations and political instability made German banks incapable of providing adequate financing. American firms with sufficient capital and risk tolerance could essentially buy into German industrial operations at bargain prices, then profit enormously as those operations recovered. The strategy required careful navigation of complex international politics and financial regulations. But for firms willing to master those complexities, the returns were extraordinary. Between 1924 and 1929, American investments in German industry generated some of the highest returns available anywhere in the global economy. Prescott Bush proved exceptionally talented at managing these German relationships. Unlike many American businessmen who treated European investments as distant, abstract financial instruments, Bush understood that success required building personal relationships with German industrialists. He learned German business customs, studied German corporate law, and most importantly, identified which German business leaders were most likely to achieve long-term success. One relationship proved particularly significant. Fritz Thyssen, heir to Germany's largest steel fortune and one of the country's most influential industrialists. Thyssen controlled massive steel production facilities, coal mines, and related industrial operations throughout Germany. His companies employed hundreds of thousands of workers and supplied raw materials to much of German heavy industry. What made Thyssen especially attractive as a business partner was his political sophistication. Unlike many German industrialists who remained focused purely on business operations, Thyssen understood that Germany's economic recovery would depend heavily on political stability. Throughout the 1920s, he actively supported political movements that promised to restore German economic strength and international influence. By 1931, Thyssen's political instincts led him to provide crucial early financial support to a rising political movement led by Adolf Hitler. Thyssen wasn't motivated by Nazi ideology, he was motivated by business calculation. The Nazi Party promised to restore German economic power, eliminate communist influence in labor unions, and create political conditions that would allow German industry to compete effectively with British and American firms. Prescott Bush's business relationship with Thyssen deepened precisely as Thyssen was increasing his support for Hitler's political movement. In 1931, when Harriman merged with Brown Brothers to form Brown Brothers Harriman, Bush was appointed to manage the new firm's German investments. His primary responsibility involved overseeing Union Banking Corporation, which served as the American financial agent for Thyssen's business operations. This appointment represented more than just career advancement. It placed Bush at the center of a financial network that was actively supporting Hitler's rise to power. Union Banking Corporation didn't just manage Thyssen's American investments, it served as a crucial financial conduit that allowed Thyssen to move money between Germany and the United States while avoiding various regulatory restrictions. The timing couldn't have been more significant. In 1932, as Germany's political crisis intensified, Thyssen increased his financial support for the Nazi Party. Hitler's movement needed enormous amounts of money to fund rallies, propaganda campaigns, and paramilitary operations across Germany. Traditional German banks were reluctant to provide such financing, partly because of political concerns and partly because of regulatory restrictions. American financial institutions like Union Banking Corporation offered a solution. Money could be moved from Germany to American accounts, then transferred back to Germany through various financial instruments that appeared to be legitimate business transactions. The profits from German industrial operations could be used to fund political activities without leaving obvious paper trails that German authorities could easily track. Prescott Bush's role in these operations wasn't passive or accidental. As managing director of Union Banking Corporation, he personally approved the financial transactions that moved Thyssen's money between countries. He signed the documents that established the banking relationships. He attended the meetings where these financial strategies were developed and implemented. More significantly, Bush was expanding these relationships even as Hitler's political intentions became increasingly clear. The Nazi Party's anti-Semitic policies, their plans for territorial expansion, their authoritarian political methods, none of this was secret by 1932. Anyone doing business with Nazi supporters like Thyssen understood exactly what political movement they were helping to finance. Yet Bush's German business operations grew throughout this period. Union Banking Corporation increased its transactions with Thyssen-connected companies. Brown Brothers Harriman expanded its German investment portfolio. Rather than distancing himself from Nazi-connected business partners, Bush was building deeper financial relationships with them. The strategy proved immediately profitable. Between 1932 and 1933, as Hitler consolidated power, German industrial companies with strong Nazi connections saw their valuations skyrocket. Thyssen's steel operations received massive government contracts. Companies that had supported Hitler's rise gained preferential access to raw materials, government financing, and political protection. American investors who had positioned themselves properly benefited enormously from these developments. Bush's German-connected investments generated exceptional returns precisely because they were connected to the Nazi regime's economic policies. But profits came with moral implications that Bush seemed willing to ignore. By 1933, Hitler's intentions were no longer theoretical possibilities. They were documented government policies. The Nazi regime had begun implementing anti-Semitic laws, establishing concentration camps, and preparing for territorial expansion that would inevitably lead to war. Any American businessman continuing to work with Nazi-connected companies after 1933 was making a conscious choice to prioritize profits over ethical concerns. They were deciding that personal financial gain justified supporting a regime whose policies were fundamentally incompatible with American values. Prescott Bush made that choice. Rather than liquidating his German investments when Hitler came to power, he expanded them. Rather than distancing himself from Nazi-connected business partners, he deepened those relationships. Rather than accepting lower returns from safer investments, he chose to continue profiting from his connections to Hitler's regime. This decision would define not just Bush's personal fortune, but the financial foundation upon which his family would build their political dynasty. The Nazi money that flowed through Union Banking Corporation and Brown Brothers Harriman in the 1930s would eventually finance George H.W. Bush's political career and contribute to George W. Bush's presidential campaigns. The transformation had begun. An American businessman had chosen to build his family's future on profits from Hitler's Germany. But the full scope of those profits and the methods used to protect them was far more extensive than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 2. Steel Empire. By 1934, Prescott Bush had become one of the most important American financiers of Nazi Germany's industrial expansion, but the true scale of his operations remained hidden behind a maze of corporate structures that few people understood. The centerpiece of Bush's Nazi-connected empire was his relationship with the Thyssen industrial network, but this wasn't simply a matter of owning stock in German companies. What Bush had helped create was a sophisticated international financial system that allowed Nazi-connected businesses to operate across multiple countries, while avoiding the scrutiny of government regulators who were becoming increasingly suspicious of American-German business relationships. Fritz Thyssen wasn't just any German industrialist. He controlled the largest steel production network in Europe. His companies operated massive foundries throughout Germany, coal mines in the Ruhr Valley, and related industrial facilities that produced everything from railway equipment to armaments. More importantly, Thyssen had been one of Hitler's earliest and most significant financial supporters, contributing millions of marks to Nazi political operations throughout the early 1930s. What made Thyssen's relationship with American financiers so valuable was his understanding of how international business could serve Nazi political objectives. Thyssen recognized that Germany's planned territorial expansion would require industrial capacity that exceeded what German companies could finance independently. Success would depend on accessing American capital markets while maintaining political relationships with the Nazi regime. Prescott Bush's role in this system extended far beyond managing investments for a single client. Through Union Banking Corporation, Brown Brothers Harriman, and a network of related companies, Bush had become the primary American coordinator for Thyssen's international business operations. He didn't just manage money, he helped design the financial structures that made Nazi industrial expansion possible. The complexity of these arrangements was staggering. Union Banking Corporation served as the nominal owner of Thyssen's American assets, but actual control remained with Thyssen through a series of trust agreements and management contracts that kept his identity hidden from American regulators. Brown Brothers Harriman provided investment banking services that helped Thyssen companies access American capital markets. Additional shell companies handled specific transactions, owned particular assets, or managed relationships with other German industrialists who were expanding their American operations. But the true genius of the system lay in how it transformed Nazi industrial profits into respectable American investments. Money generated by Thyssen's German operations, including profits from companies that used slave labor and received preferential government contracts because of Thyssen's Nazi connections, could be moved to American accounts, invested in American companies, and then reinvested back into German operations through financial instruments that appeared to be legitimate international business transactions. The scale of these operations became clear through Bush's involvement with Consolidated Silesian Steel Company, one of the most important industrial operations in Nazi Germany. Located in territory that Germany had recently annexed from Poland, Consolidated Silesian represented exactly the kind of aggressive expansion that characterized Nazi economic policy in the mid-1930s. Consolidated Silesian wasn't just a steel company, it was a symbol of Nazi territorial ambitions made real through industrial investment. The company operated massive steel production facilities using Polish workers who had essentially been converted into a captive labor force after Germany's annexation of their territory. These workers received subsistence wages while producing steel that would eventually be used to manufacture weapons for Germany's military expansion. American investment in Consolidated Silesian wasn't accidental or incidental. It was a conscious decision to financially support Nazi territorial expansion. When American firms like Brown Brothers Harriman provided capital to Consolidated Silesian, they were directly funding operations that epitomized Nazi policies: territorial conquest, exploitation of conquered populations, and subordination of human welfare to industrial production goals. Prescott Bush's involvement with Consolidated Silesian went beyond simple investment. He served on boards of directors for companies that managed Consolidated Silesian's American financial relationships. He personally approved transactions that moved money between Consolidated Silesian and its American financial partners. He helped design the corporate structures that allowed Consolidated Silesian to access American capital markets while maintaining its connections to the Nazi regime. The profits from these arrangements were extraordinary. Between 1934 and 1939, American investments in Consolidated Silesian generated returns that exceeded 20% annually, far higher than typical American industrial investments during the same period. These exceptional returns reflected the unique advantages available to companies operating under Nazi economic policies: access to cheap labor, preferential government contracts, protection from labor organizing, and guaranteed markets in territories conquered by German military forces. But Consolidated Silesian represented only one component of Bush's Nazi business network. Through Union Banking Corporation and Brown Brothers Harriman, Bush was involved in financing multiple German companies that were benefiting from Nazi economic policies. Silesian American Corporation managed additional industrial investments in German annexed territories. Hamburg America Line, the German shipping company, provided transportation services that were crucial to Nazi operations in South America and other international markets. Hamburg America Line deserves particular attention because it illustrates how Bush's Nazi connections extended beyond simple financial relationships into active support for Nazi political operations. The shipping company didn't just transport commercial goods. It served as a crucial logistics network for Nazi intelligence operations, propaganda distribution, and political organizing in countries throughout Latin America. Throughout the 1930s, Hamburg America Line ships carried Nazi political operatives to Argentina, Brazil, and other South American countries where they worked to build political movements sympathetic to German interests. The ships transported propaganda materials, communication equipment, and financial resources that supported pro-Nazi political organizations throughout Latin America. They provided transportation for German intelligence operatives who were gathering information about American military capabilities and industrial production. Bush's involvement with Hamburg America Line made him complicit in these intelligence and propaganda operations. As a director of companies that managed Hamburg America Line's American operations, Bush had access to information about the shipping company's routes, cargo, and passengers. He approved financial transactions that supported Hamburg America Line's operations. He helped design corporate structures that allowed the shipping company to operate in American ports while maintaining its connections to Nazi intelligence services. The sophistication of these arrangements reflected careful planning by American businessmen who understood that their Nazi connections would eventually face government scrutiny. Rather than creating simple, transparent business relationships that could be easily investigated, Bush and his associates developed complex corporate structures designed to obscure the true nature of their German business partnerships. Multiple layers of shell companies made it difficult for investigators to trace the ultimate sources and destinations of financial transactions. Trust arrangements allowed beneficial ownership of assets to be separated from nominal legal ownership. Management contracts permitted operational control to be exercised by parties who didn't appear on official corporate documents. These structures weren't created by accident. They were designed by skilled lawyers and accountants who understood how to navigate American corporate law in ways that would protect their clients from both regulatory investigation and public scrutiny. The goal wasn't just to generate profits from Nazi-connected businesses, but to do so in ways that would allow those profits to be maintained, even if American-German business relationships became politically impossible. The planning proved prescient. As America moved closer to war throughout the late 1930s, public opinion became increasingly hostile to American businesses that maintained obvious connections to Nazi Germany. Companies that had been profitable investments suddenly became political liabilities. Businessmen who had built careers on German relationships found themselves facing public criticism and potential government investigation. But Bush's Nazi-connected investments were structured in ways that made them difficult to identify and hard to criticize. Union Banking Corporation appeared to be a standard American financial institution. Brown Brothers Harriman was a respected Wall Street firm with a long history of international investment. The shell companies and trust arrangements that connected these institutions to Nazi businesses were so complex that even sophisticated investigators had difficulty understanding their true purpose. This complexity wasn't just legal protection, it was political camouflage. Bush could continue profiting from Nazi industrial expansion while maintaining his reputation as a respectable American businessman. He could attend dinner parties with other Wall Street executives, contribute to Republican political campaigns, and build social relationships with influential Americans, all while his business operations continued generating exceptional profits from companies that were helping to fund Hitler's military preparations. The moral implications of these arrangements were staggering. While American newspapers reported on Nazi persecution of Jews, Bush's companies continued providing financial services to Nazi-connected businesses. While American politicians debated how to respond to German territorial expansion, Bush's investments were helping to finance that expansion. While American military planners prepared for potential conflict with Germany, Bush's business operations were strengthening the industrial base that would support German military operations. Yet Bush continued expanding these relationships throughout the late 1930s. Rather than reducing his exposure to Nazi-connected businesses as war became increasingly likely, he found ways to deepen and protect those relationships. He worked with lawyers to create additional shell companies that could continue operating even if direct American-German business became impossible. He helped establish trust arrangements that could protect Nazi-connected assets from potential government seizure. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and World War II began in Europe, Prescott Bush had spent 5 years building one of the most extensive and profitable American business relationships with Nazi Germany. His companies had provided millions of dollars in financing for Nazi industrial operations. His investments had generated exceptional returns precisely because they were connected to businesses that benefited from Nazi economic policies. Most importantly, Bush had created financial structures that could continue operating and generating profits even after America entered the war against Nazi Germany. The network he had built wasn't just designed to benefit from Nazi industrial expansion. It was designed to survive the political and military conflict that would inevitably result from that expansion. The foundation was complete. Now it was time to test whether it could withstand the pressures of global war. Chapter 3. Nazi Contracts. The year 1939 marked a turning point that would test every aspect of Prescott Bush's carefully constructed Nazi business network. But instead of retreating from these dangerous relationships, Bush doubled down on them. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, most American businessmen with German investments began immediate damage control. They liquidated holdings, terminated contracts, and distanced themselves from anything that might be perceived as supporting Nazi aggression. The writing was on the wall. America would eventually enter this war, and when that happened, anyone connected to Nazi businesses would face severe consequences. Prescott Bush chose a different path entirely. Rather than reducing his Nazi connections, Bush spent the period between September 1939 and December 1941, those crucial 27 months when America remained officially neutral but was clearly preparing for war, deepening and protecting his German business relationships in ways that would allow them to continue operating even after America entered the conflict. This wasn't naive business calculation. By 1939, Bush had been working with Nazi-connected companies for 8 years. He understood exactly what the Nazi regime represented, what Hitler's territorial ambitions meant, and how German industrial expansion was directly connected to military preparations for a war that would inevitably include America as an enemy. Bush's decision to maintain and expand his Nazi business relationships during this period represented a conscious choice to prioritize personal profit over national loyalty. While American industrial companies were beginning to retool for potential military production, Bush was helping Nazi-connected businesses strengthen their operations and protect their assets from future government seizure. The centerpiece of these efforts involved Silesian American Corporation, which Bush had helped establish to manage American investments in German industrial operations located in territory that Germany had conquered from Poland. These investments weren't just financially connected to Nazi expansion, they were physically located in areas that had been seized through military aggression and were being operated using Polish workers who had been converted into a captive labor force. Silesian American Corporation represented everything that was morally problematic about American business relationships with Nazi Germany. The company existed solely to extract profits from industrial operations that epitomized Nazi policies: territorial conquest, exploitation of conquered populations, and subordination of human welfare to German industrial production goals. What made Bush's continued involvement with Silesian American particularly significant was that the company's operations were expanding throughout 1940 and 1941, precisely as Nazi policies in conquered territories were becoming increasingly brutal. Polish workers in German-controlled industrial facilities weren't just receiving low wages, they were being subjected to conditions that amounted to industrial slavery. These workers had no legal rights, no ability to organize, no option to seek alternative employment. They worked 12-hour shifts in dangerous conditions while receiving subsistence rations that kept them barely alive. They were housed in company-controlled barracks that resembled prison camps. They were subject to arbitrary punishment, including physical violence, for any behavior that German supervisors considered unsatisfactory. American investors in companies like Silesian American weren't passive beneficiaries of these conditions. They were active participants in creating and maintaining them. The exceptional profits that Bush's Nazi-connected investments generated during this period were directly connected to the exploitation of Polish workers who had been reduced to industrial slavery. But Silesian American represented only the most obvious component of Bush's expanding Nazi business network. Throughout 1940 and 1941, Bush was also deepening his relationships with other German companies that were playing crucial roles in Nazi military preparations. Union Banking Corporation, the financial institution that Bush managed on behalf of Fritz Thyssen, was handling increasingly large transactions connected to German armaments production. Brown Brothers Harriman, the investment bank where Bush served as a senior partner, was providing financial services to American subsidiaries of German companies that were manufacturing weapons, ammunition, and military equipment for Nazi forces. Most significantly, Bush was involved in managing American operations for companies that were directly supporting Nazi military expansion in conquered territories. These companies weren't just selling products to Germany, they were helping to establish industrial infrastructure in countries that Germany had occupied, infrastructure that was being used to extract resources and exploit populations in ways that violated every principle of international law. The Hamburg-America shipping line, which Bush helped manage through various corporate connections, was providing transportation services that were crucial to Nazi operations throughout Latin America and other international markets. But Hamburg-America's role extended far beyond commercial shipping. The company was serving as a key logistics network for Nazi intelligence operations and propaganda distribution. Throughout 1940 and 1941, Hamburg-America ships were carrying Nazi intelligence operatives to Argentina, Brazil, and other South American countries where they worked to build political movements that could support German interests if war expanded to the Western Hemisphere. The ships transported communication equipment that allowed Nazi operatives to maintain contact with Germany. They carried financial resources that supported pro-Nazi political organizations throughout Latin America. Bush's involvement with Hamburg-America made him complicit in Nazi intelligence operations that were directly threatening American national security. As tensions between America and Germany increased throughout 1941, Nazi operatives in Latin America were gathering information about American military capabilities, industrial production, and strategic planning that could be used against American forces if war erupted. Yet Bush continued supporting Hamburg-America's operations, even as evidence mounted that the shipping company was serving Nazi intelligence objectives. He approved financial transactions that supported Hamburg-America's South American operations. He helped maintain corporate structures that allowed Hamburg-America to operate in American ports while conducting intelligence activities that threatened American security interests. The scope of Bush's Nazi business network during this period extended far beyond what most historians have recognized. Through Union Banking Corporation, Brown Brothers Harriman, and multiple shell companies, Bush was involved in financing German companies that were manufacturing everything from steel and coal to chemicals and transportation equipment that would eventually be used by Nazi forces against American soldiers. Consolidated Silesian Steel Company, one of Bush's most important investments, was producing steel that was being used to manufacture tanks, artillery, and other military equipment for German forces preparing to invade the Soviet Union. American investment in Consolidated Silesian wasn't just supporting German industrial capacity. It was directly contributing to Nazi military capabilities that would soon be used against America's allies. Seamless Steel Equipment Corporation, another Bush-connected company, was manufacturing specialized steel products that were crucial to German submarine production. These submarines would eventually attack American merchant ships, sink vessels carrying American supplies to Britain, and kill American sailors who were trying to support Britain's resistance to Nazi aggression. The moral implications of these business relationships were staggering, but they were also enormously profitable. Between 1939 and 1941, Bush's Nazi-connected investments generated some of the highest returns available anywhere in the American economy. While most American businesses faced uncertainty and declining profits as war preparations disrupted normal commercial operations, Bush's German-connected companies benefited from virtually unlimited government contracts, access to cheap labor, and guaranteed markets in territories controlled by German military forces. These exceptional profits weren't accidental. They were the direct result of Nazi economic policies that subordinated all business considerations to military and political objectives. Companies that supported Nazi goals received preferential government financing, protection from labor organizing, access to raw materials, and markets in conquered territories. Companies that opposed or failed to support Nazi objectives faced government harassment, loss of contracts, and potential seizure of assets. Bush's decision to maintain and expand his investments in Nazi-connected companies during this period represented a conscious choice to benefit from these policies. He was betting that Nazi economic expansion would continue generating exceptional profits even as military conflict became inevitable, and he was structuring his investments to capture those profits while minimizing his exposure to potential government retaliation. The sophistication of Bush's financial planning during this period reflected careful consultation with lawyers and accountants who understood how to protect assets from government seizure. Multiple layers of shell companies made it difficult for investigators to trace the ultimate beneficiaries of Nazi-connected investments. Trust arrangements separated beneficial ownership from legal ownership in ways that could protect assets even if direct business relationships became impossible. International financial structures allowed money to be moved between American and German accounts through third-party countries that remained neutral in the developing conflict. Swiss banks, South American financial institutions, and other intermediaries provided services that could disguise the true sources and destinations of financial transactions. Most importantly, Bush was establishing American subsidiaries and related companies that could continue operating and generating profits even if their German parent companies faced government restrictions or seizure. These American operations would retain access to valuable intellectual property, customer relationships, and business processes that had been developed by their Nazi-connected partners. By December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and America finally entered World War II, Prescott Bush had spent more than 2 years preparing his Nazi business network to survive and profit from the very conflict that his investments had helped make possible. While American families mourned sons and husbands who died at Pearl Harbor, Bush's companies continued generating profits from business relationships with the enemy that had attacked America. While American workers retooled factories to produce weapons for American soldiers, Bush's investments continued supporting German companies that were manufacturing weapons to kill those same soldiers. The contradiction was morally indefensible, but it was also financially brilliant. Bush had created a business empire that could profit from Nazi expansion during peacetime and continue profiting from Nazi operations during wartime, all while maintaining the legal and political protections available to American business operations. But this carefully constructed system would soon face its greatest test. The US government was beginning to investigate American businesses with German connections, and some of those investigations were starting to focus on the complex financial networks that men like Prescott Bush had spent years building and protecting. The question wasn't whether Bush's Nazi connections would be discovered. The question was whether the financial structures he had created would be sophisticated enough to protect his assets from government seizure and his reputation from public exposure. The answer would determine not just Bush's personal fortune, but the financial foundation upon which his family would build their political dynasty for decades to come. Chapter 4. War Profits. December 7, 1941, changed everything for most American businessmen with German connections, but for Prescott Bush, Pearl Harbor represented an opportunity to test whether years of careful financial planning could allow him to continue profiting from Nazi operations even while America was at war with Germany. The challenge was unprecedented. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, President Roosevelt had signed declarations of war against Japan and Germany. The Trading with the Enemy Act gave the federal government sweeping powers to seize any American assets connected to hostile foreign powers. FBI agents were already investigating American businesses suspected of maintaining financial relationships with German companies. Most American businessmen in similar situations would have immediately liquidated any remaining German investments and cooperated fully with government investigations. Self-preservation demanded complete transparency and enthusiastic patriotism. Any hint of continued German business connections could result in criminal prosecution, asset seizure, and public humiliation. Prescott Bush chose a different strategy entirely. Rather than abandoning his Nazi-connected business network, he activated sophisticated financial structures that had been designed specifically to protect those relationships from exactly this kind of government scrutiny. The centerpiece of Bush's wartime strategy involved a web of American subsidiaries and shell companies that could continue operating even if their German parent companies were officially designated as enemy assets. These American operations retained access to valuable German intellectual property, manufacturing processes, and business relationships while maintaining apparent independence from their Nazi-connected origins. Union Banking Corporation, the financial institution that Bush managed on behalf of Fritz Thyssen, didn't simply shut down when America entered the war. Instead, it continued operating under complex trust arrangements that were designed to make government investigation as difficult as possible. Beneficial ownership of the company's assets was separated from legal ownership through multiple layers of intermediary entities. Control was exercised through management contracts and advisory relationships that didn't appear on official corporate documents. The sophistication of these arrangements reflected years of planning by lawyers who understood exactly how federal investigations operated and what kind of evidence investigators would need to prove illegal activity. Simply demonstrating that American companies had business relationships with German firms wouldn't be sufficient to justify asset seizure. Investigators would need to prove that those relationships constituted active collaboration with enemy operations. Bush's financial structures were designed to make such proof nearly impossible to obtain. Money moved between accounts through multiple intermediaries. Business decisions were made through informal communications that left minimal paper trails. Ownership structures were so complex that even sophisticated accountants had difficulty determining who ultimately controlled particular assets. But the real genius of Bush's wartime strategy lay in how his companies continued generating profits from German operations without appearing to violate trading with the Enemy Act restrictions. American subsidiaries of German companies could continue operating as long as they maintained apparent independence from their German parents. Trust arrangements could protect assets that were technically owned by enemy nationals, as long as those assets were managed by American trustees who claimed to be acting independently. These legal fictions allowed Bush's companies to continue benefiting from their German connections while avoiding obvious violations of wartime regulations. Seamless Steel Equipment Corporation continued manufacturing specialized steel products using German-developed processes, but the company claimed its operations were entirely independent of its German origins. Various shipping operations continued providing services that benefited German business operations in neutral countries, but those services were structured as separate transactions that didn't technically violate American law. Most significantly, Bush's companies continued receiving profits from German operations that were using slave labor to manufacture products for Nazi military forces. These profits were disguised as returns on American investments that appeared to be independent of their German sources, but the money ultimately derived from industrial operations that epitomized Nazi exploitation of conquered populations. The moral implications were staggering. While American soldiers were dying in battles against German forces, Bush's companies were continuing to profit from the industrial operations that supplied those same German forces with weapons and equipment. While American families were rationing food and gasoline to support the war effort, Bush was maintaining business relationships that provided resources to America's enemies. Yet Bush's wartime business operations remained almost entirely hidden from public view. The complex financial structures that protected his Nazi-connected assets also concealed them from journalists, congressional investigators, and even most government officials. Only a small number of federal agents with access to specialized financial intelligence had any understanding of how Bush's business network actually operated. This secrecy wasn't accidental. It was the result of careful cultivation of relationships with government officials who had the authority to protect Bush's operations from unwanted scrutiny. Samuel Bush's wartime service had given the family connections throughout the military-industrial complex. Prescott's own relationships with other Wall Street executives provided access to informal networks of businessmen who shared similar interests in protecting profitable business operations from government interference. Most importantly, Bush benefited from the simple reality that investigating complex international financial arrangements required resources and expertise that were in short supply during wartime. Federal agents were focused primarily on obvious security threats and clear violations of wartime regulations. Sophisticated financial structures that might be technically legal, even if morally questionable, received much lower priority than more immediate concerns. This prioritization allowed Bush's companies to continue operating throughout 1942 and 1943 with minimal government interference. Union Banking Corporation continued managing Thyssen-connected assets. Brown Brothers Harriman continued providing financial services to American subsidiaries of German companies. Various shell companies continued generating profits from business relationships that had originated in Nazi-connected operations. The profits from these wartime operations were substantial. Between 1942 and 1944, Bush's German-connected investments continued generating exceptional returns, in some cases exceeding the profits available from purely American business operations. These returns reflected the unique advantages available to companies that could maintain access to German industrial processes, intellectual property, and international business relationships even during wartime. But profits came with increasing risks. As the war progressed, government investigations became more sophisticated and more persistent. Federal agents were developing better understanding of how international financial networks operated. Congressional committees were beginning to ask harder questions about American businesses that had maintained German connections before the war. The pressure increased dramatically in 1942, when government investigators finally identified Union Banking Corporation as a financial institution that was essentially operating on behalf of Fritz Thyssen, one of Hitler's most important early supporters. The investigation revealed that Union Banking Corporation wasn't just doing business with Thyssen. It was serving as Thyssen's primary American financial agent, managing millions of dollars in assets that belonged to one of Nazi Germany's most significant industrial operations. On October 20, 1942, the federal government finally acted. Under authority granted by the Trading with the Enemy Act, government agents seized Union Banking Corporation's assets and officially designated the company as an enemy financial institution. Similar action was taken against several other Bush-connected companies, including Seamless Steel Equipment Corporation and various shipping operations that had been providing services to Nazi-connected businesses. The seizures represented the most serious threat that Bush's Nazi business network had ever faced. Government investigators now had direct access to Union Banking Corporation's financial records, which contained detailed information about Bush's relationships with Thyssen and other German industrialists. Congressional committees could subpoena Bush to testify about his role in managing assets that belonged to Nazi supporters, but the seizures also revealed the effectiveness of Bush's financial planning. While the government had identified and seized the most obvious components of Bush's Nazi business network, The majority of his German-connected assets remained protected through complex trust arrangements and shell company structures that investigators hadn't yet identified. Union Banking Corporation represented only the tip of the iceberg. The deeper financial relationships, the trust arrangements that separated beneficial ownership from legal ownership, the shell companies that continued operating under different names, those remained untouched by government investigation. More importantly, the asset seizures were structured in ways that would eventually allow Bush to recover much of his confiscated wealth. Rather than permanently confiscating the seized assets, the government was holding them as enemy property that could potentially be returned to legitimate American owners after the war ended. Bush's lawyers were already preparing legal arguments that could allow him to reclaim his Nazi-connected investments by demonstrating that he had been an innocent American businessman who had been manipulated by German clients. This legal strategy represented the final component of Bush's wartime planning. Even if his Nazi business connections were discovered and his assets were seized, he had positioned himself to argue that he had been a victim of German deception rather than a willing collaborator with Nazi operations. The complex financial structures that had protected his assets from government investigation could also be used to argue that he hadn't understood the true nature of his German business relationships. The strategy required careful presentation, but it was legally plausible. American law required prosecutors to prove intentional collaboration with enemy operations, not just business relationships that happened to benefit enemy forces. If Bush could demonstrate that his German investments had been structured through intermediaries who had concealed their Nazi connections, he could potentially avoid both criminal prosecution and permanent asset forfeiture. By 1944, as Allied forces advanced across Europe and Nazi defeat became inevitable, Bush was already implementing this legal strategy. His lawyers were preparing documentation that portrayed him as an American patriot who had been deceived by German business partners. They were developing arguments that his financial arrangements had been legitimate international business transactions that had been manipulated by German clients for purposes that Bush hadn't understood. Most importantly, they were positioning Bush to recover his seized assets by demonstrating that those assets had belonged to American trustees rather than German enemy nationals. The same complex ownership structures that had allowed Bush to profit from Nazi operations during wartime could now be used to argue that those operations had always been under American control. The transformation was remarkable. A businessman who had spent more than a decade building profitable relationships with Nazi Germany was preparing to emerge from World War II as a victim of German deception rather than a collaborator with America's enemies. But the success of this strategy would depend on more than just legal arguments. It would require political connections that could influence how government officials handled the complex issues surrounding wartime asset seizures. It would demand public relations expertise that could shape how Bush's wartime business activities were presented to American voters who would eventually evaluate his family's political ambitions. Most importantly, it would need careful management of the evidence that documented Bush's actual role in financing Nazi operations. Some records would need to be sealed or destroyed. Other documents would need to be reinterpreted or explained away. Key witnesses would need to be convinced to remain silent or to present carefully structured testimony that supported Bush's preferred narrative. The war was ending, but the battle for control of the Bush family's Nazi-connected fortune was just beginning. Chapter 5: Hidden Assets. The end of World War II in 1945 should have marked the conclusion of Prescott Bush's Nazi business connections, but instead it revealed the beginning of the most sophisticated asset protection scheme in American financial history. When Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Europe and the full scope of Nazi atrocities became undeniable, any American businessman who had maintained financial relationships with Nazi Germany faced potential prosecution, permanent asset forfeiture, and complete social ostracism. The moral weight of the Holocaust made any hint of Nazi collaboration politically and socially toxic. Most American businessmen in similar situations would have accepted their losses, cooperated fully with government investigations, and attempted to rebuild their reputations through public expressions of remorse and charitable contributions to Holocaust survivors. The smart play was complete transparency, combined with generous philanthropy, aimed at distancing oneself from any association with Nazi operations. Prescott Bush chose the opposite approach. Rather than accepting responsibility for his Nazi connections or surrendering his German-derived wealth, Bush activated a complex legal and financial strategy designed to recover his seized assets while rewriting the history of his wartime business activities. The centerpiece of this strategy involved challenging the federal government's seizure of Union Banking Corporation and related companies under the Trading with the Enemy Act. Bush's lawyers argued that their client had been an innocent American businessman who had been manipulated by German clients who had concealed their true Nazi connections. They claimed that Bush had believed he was managing legitimate international investments that happened to involve German companies, not assets that belonged to Nazi supporters. This legal argument required extensive reinterpretation of evidence that clearly demonstrated Bush's deep involvement in Nazi-connected business operations. Documents showing Bush's personal approval of transactions with Fritz Thyssen were characterized as routine business decisions that hadn't reflected understanding of Thyssen's political activities. Corporate records demonstrating Bush's role in establishing shell companies to protect Nazi assets were presented as standard international business structures that had been misused by German clients without Bush's knowledge. The strategy was legally ambitious and factually problematic, but it was also politically astute. By 1947, as Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, American government officials were less interested in pursuing complex investigations of wartime business relationships than they were in building domestic political unity against the new communist threat. Businessmen who could present themselves as loyal Americans who had been victimized by foreign enemies were more useful than businessmen who faced ongoing investigations for enemy collaboration. Bush's lawyers understood this political shift and structured their legal arguments accordingly. They portrayed Bush not as a Nazi collaborator, but as an American patriot who had been deceived by German business partners who had hidden their true loyalties. They emphasized Bush's American birth, his military service in World War I, and his prominent role in respectable Wall Street institutions. More importantly, they developed detailed arguments that the seized assets had never actually belonged to Nazi supporters, but had been held in trust by American businessmen who had been managing those assets on behalf of what they believed were legitimate German business interests. This argument transformed Bush from a Nazi collaborator into a victim of German deception who deserved to recover assets that had been wrongfully seized by overzealous government investigators. The legal strategy required careful management of evidence and testimony. Documents that clearly demonstrated Bush's understanding of his Nazi connections were either sealed from public view or reinterpreted through expert testimony that emphasized the complexity of international business relationships during the 1930s and 1940s. Witnesses who could provide damaging testimony about Bush's activities were either persuaded to remain silent or had their credibility questioned through aggressive cross-examination. Most significantly, Bush's lawyers were able to take advantage of the federal government's limited resources for complex financial investigations. Proving that Bush had knowingly collaborated with Nazi operations required extensive analysis of international business records, translation of German documents, and testimony from witnesses who were scattered across war-torn Europe. Federal prosecutors had limited budgets and competing priorities that made such complex investigations difficult to pursue effectively. The combination of sophisticated legal arguments, favorable political conditions, and limited government resources produced remarkable results. In 1951, nearly 6 years after the war's end, the federal government agreed to return substantial assets to Bush and other American businessmen who had been connected to the seized Nazi-related companies. The asset recovery wasn't complete. Some holdings remained permanently confiscated, and Bush faced ongoing legal restrictions on certain types of international business activities. But the majority of Bush's Nazi-derived wealth was returned through complex legal arrangements that allowed him to access those funds while maintaining apparent compliance with federal regulations. The financial impact was enormous. The recovered assets included not just the original investments that Bush had made in Nazi-connected companies, but also accumulated profits that those investments had generated throughout the war years. Compound returns on investments that had benefited from slave labor and Nazi government contracts had produced wealth that exceeded what Bush could have earned from any purely American business operations during the same period. But the true genius of Bush's asset recovery strategy lay not in the money that was returned, but in how that money was subsequently invested and protected. Rather than simply rebuilding the same kind of international business relationships that had created legal problems, Bush used his recovered Nazi wealth to establish a new kind of American business empire that could generate ongoing profits while remaining largely invisible to public scrutiny. The foundation of this new strategy was domestic investment in American industries that were positioned to benefit from Cold War defense spending. Bush used his recovered Nazi assets to acquire interests in oil companies, defense contractors, and related industries that would receive substantial government contracts as America built up its military capabilities to confront Soviet expansion. These investments offered several crucial advantages over Bush's previous Nazi-connected business operations. They generated substantial profits from government contracts without creating obvious political vulnerabilities. They provided Bush with legitimate business credentials that could support his family's emerging political ambitions. Most importantly, they transformed Nazi-derived wealth into respectable American business assets that couldn't be traced back to their controversial origins. The transformation was systematic and sophisticated. Money that had originated from profits on Nazi industrial operations was invested in Texas oil companies that would eventually become major suppliers to the U.S. military. Funds that had been generated through business relationships with Fritz Thyssen were used to establish financial services companies that would manage investments for other wealthy American families. Bush's recovered Nazi wealth also provided the capital needed to support his entry into Republican politics. Running for the U.S. Senate required substantial financial resources for campaign expenses, political contributions, and the kind of lifestyle that would allow Bush to build relationships with other wealthy Republican donors. The money that had originally been generated through Nazi business connections now provided the foundation for Bush's emergence as a respected Republican political figure. But the most important component of Bush's asset protection strategy involved creating financial structures that could transfer his Nazi-derived wealth to the next generation while concealing its controversial origins. Trust arrangements, family foundations, and complex corporate structures were designed to provide Bush's children with access to substantial family wealth, while making it nearly impossible for future investigators to trace that wealth back to its Nazi-connected sources. These financial structures weren't just legal arrangements. They were historical camouflage, designed to allow the Bush family to benefit from Nazi-derived wealth for generations, while maintaining their reputation as patriotic American political leaders. Future Bush family members could access substantial inherited wealth without having any obvious connection to the Nazi business operations that had originally generated that wealth. The complexity of these arrangements reflected lessons that Bush had learned from his earlier experiences with government investigations. Rather than creating obvious connections that could be easily traced, the new financial structures involved multiple layers of intermediary entities that made beneficial ownership nearly impossible to determine. Money moved between accounts through pathways that were so complex that even sophisticated investigators would have difficulty following the complete trail. International components added additional layers of protection. Some assets were held through foreign entities that were beyond the reach of American investigators. Other holdings were structured through international partnerships that could claim exemption from American disclosure requirements. Financial advisors in multiple countries provided services that could disguise the ultimate sources and destinations of particular investments. But the most sophisticated component of Bush's asset protection strategy involved the systematic destruction and concealment of historical records that could document his Nazi business connections. Corporate documents, personal correspondence, and financial records that could provide evidence of Bush's wartime activities were either destroyed entirely or sealed in private archives that were inaccessible to independent researchers. This historical sanitization wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate effort to ensure that future investigations of Bush family wealth would be unable to access the evidence needed to trace that wealth back to its Nazi origins. By controlling access to historical records, Bush could essentially rewrite the history of his family's financial development. The strategy proved remarkably effective. By 1952, when Bush won election to the US Senate, his Nazi business connections had been almost entirely erased from public awareness. Newspaper coverage of his political campaigns made no mention of his wartime business activities. Political opponents seemed unaware of his controversial financial history. Even sophisticated political investigators had difficulty accessing the evidence needed to document Bush's Nazi connections. Bush had successfully transformed himself from a Nazi collaborator into a respected American political leader. His seized assets had been recovered, his Nazi-derived wealth had been laundered into respectable American investments, and his historical record had been sanitized to conceal his controversial business activities. But most importantly, Bush had established financial structures that would allow his family to continue benefiting from Nazi-derived wealth for decades to come. His son, George H.W. Bush, would inherit not just substantial financial resources, but also the political connections and business relationships that had been built, using money that originally came from Nazi operations. The transformation was complete, but the evidence of its true origins remained hidden in government archives and sealed corporate records that would take decades for independent researchers to discover and decode. Chapter 6. Power Transfer. By 1952, Prescott Bush had achieved something that should have been impossible. He had transformed Nazi-derived wealth into the foundation for American political power, and now he was ready to transfer that power to the next generation. Bush's election to the US Senate represented far more than just personal political success. It marked the completion of a remarkable historical transformation. A businessman who had spent more than a decade profiting from Nazi industrial operations had successfully reinvented himself as a respected American political leader whose family background was considered an asset rather than a liability. But the real significance of Bush's Senate victory lay not in what it meant for his own career, but in what it made possible for his children, particularly his son George Herbert Walker Bush, who was already showing signs of inheriting both his father's business instincts and his talent for navigating complex political relationships. George H.W. Bush's early business career provides crucial insight into how Nazi-derived wealth was systematically transferred and laundered through legitimate American business operations. In 1950, at age 26, the younger Bush moved to Texas to enter the oil business with financial backing that was officially described as coming from family connections and Wall Street investors who had confidence in his potential. The reality was more complex and more controversial. The capital that launched George H.W. Bush's oil career came directly from his father's recovered Nazi assets, but those funds had been so thoroughly laundered through complex financial structures that their original sources were nearly impossible to trace. Money that had been generated through business relationships with Fritz Thyssen and other Nazi industrialists was now being used to establish oil operations that would eventually generate hundreds of millions of dollars in additional wealth for the Bush family. The laundering process was sophisticated and systematic. Rather than directly transferring money from Prescott's recovered Nazi assets to his son's business operations, the Bush family used intermediary investment vehicles that could provide capital while concealing its ultimate sources. Family trusts, investment partnerships, and related financial structures created multiple layers of separation between the original Nazi-connected wealth and its eventual use in American business operations. These financial structures weren't just designed to provide capital, they were designed to provide capital that couldn't be traced back to its controversial origins. Future investigators who attempted to analyze the sources of Bush family wealth would find complex investment arrangements that appeared to be standard American business transactions, not evidence of Nazi-derived funding. The strategy reflected lessons that Prescott Bush had learned from his experiences with federal investigations during the 1940s. Rather than creating obvious connections that could be easily discovered, the family's financial arrangements were designed to withstand sophisticated scrutiny, while providing ongoing access to substantial wealth. George H.W. Bush's oil operations in Texas provided the perfect vehicle for laundering Nazi-derived wealth into respectable American business assets. The oil industry in the 1950s was characterized by rapid expansion, substantial capital requirements, and complex partnership arrangements that made it difficult for outside observers to track the ultimate sources of investment funding. More importantly, success in the Texas oil business provided George H.W. Bush with legitimate credentials as an American entrepreneur who had built his own fortune through hard work and business acumen. The narrative of a young man who moved to Texas with limited resources and built a successful oil company through personal determination was far more politically appealing than the reality of a family business empire built on recovered Nazi assets. But the younger Bush's oil operations also served a more subtle purpose in the family's long-term political strategy. Success in the Texas oil industry provided the Bush family with connections to other wealthy Texas business families who would become crucial allies in Republican politics throughout the latter half of the 20th century. These relationships weren't just social or business connections. They were political alliances that would support the Bush family's emergence as a dominant force in Republican politics. The timing of George H.W. Bush's entry into Texas business was particularly significant because it coincided with major changes in how American corporate wealth influenced political processes. The 1950s marked the beginning of a new era in which successful businessmen were increasingly expected to translate their financial success into political influence through campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and direct participation in political campaigns. Prescott Bush's Senate career provided a perfect platform for understanding and exploiting these new political opportunities. As a member of the Senate Banking Committee, he had access to information about federal economic policies that could significantly impact business operations. As a Republican leader, he could influence party positions on issues that affected wealthy donors and business interests. More importantly, Prescott's Senate service provided the Bush family with extensive networks of political relationships that could be leveraged to support future family political ambitions. These relationships weren't just casual acquaintances. They were deep political alliances built through shared interests, mutual obligations, and coordinated activities that created lasting bonds of loyalty and cooperation. The systematic nature of the Bush family's political development during the 1950s reflected careful long-term planning that extended far beyond immediate electoral considerations. Rather than simply using their wealth to support Republican candidates who shared their business interests, the Bushes were building the kind of comprehensive political network that could support their own family members' eventual campaigns for major political offices. This strategy required substantial financial resources that could be sustained over many years of political activity. Campaign contributions, lobbying expenses, social events, and related political activities demanded millions of dollars in ongoing investment without any guarantee of immediate returns. Only families with access to substantial, reliable wealth could afford to pursue such long-term political strategies. The Bush family's Nazi-derived wealth provided exactly the kind of financial foundation needed for sustained political investment. Money that had originally been generated through business relationships with Nazi industrialists was now funding Republican political activities that would eventually support the election of 2 Bush family members to the presidency of the United States. But the family's political strategy also required careful management of their historical reputation to ensure that their Nazi business connections remained hidden from public view. Any revelation of Prescott Bush's wartime activities could have devastating consequences for the family's political ambitions, particularly as awareness of Holocaust atrocities made any association with Nazi operations politically toxic. The Bush family addressed this vulnerability through systematic control of information about their business history. Corporate records that could document Prescott's Nazi connections were sealed in private archives or destroyed entirely. Family members were trained to provide carefully structured responses to any questions about their business background that emphasized legitimate American business activities while avoiding discussion of controversial international relationships. Political allies were recruited to help deflect any potential investigations of Bush family business history. Republican leaders who had benefited from Bush political contributions and support were prepared to characterize any questions about the family's background as politically motivated attacks that didn't deserve serious consideration. Media relationships were cultivated to ensure that journalists who might investigate Bush family history would face pressure to focus on the family's legitimate political achievements rather than controversial business activities that had occurred decades earlier. Publishers and editors, who depended on Republican political sources for access to important stories, had strong incentives to avoid topics that could damage their relationships with powerful Republican figures. The comprehensive nature of these protective measures reflected the Bush family's understanding that their political success depended not just on their financial resources and political connections, but also on their ability to control the narrative about their family history. Any serious investigation of their Nazi business connections could potentially unravel decades of careful political development. By 1960, the Bush family's transformation was essentially complete. Prescott Bush had established himself as one of the most respected Republican leaders in the U.S. Senate. George H.W. Bush had built a successful oil business in Texas that provided him with both substantial wealth and valuable political connections. The family's Nazi-derived assets had been thoroughly laundered through legitimate American business operations. Most importantly, the Bush family had created financial and political structures that could support their continued political advancement for generations to come. Their Nazi-connected wealth had been transformed into American political capital that could fund campaigns, influence policy decisions, and build the kind of comprehensive political networks that are essential for major political success. But the true test of the Bush family's political transformation would come in the following decades, as George H.W. Bush and his children pursued increasingly prominent political positions that would subject the family to intense public scrutiny. The question wasn't whether their Nazi business connections had been successfully concealed. The question was whether those connections could remain hidden as the Bush family moved from regional Texas politics to national prominence and eventually to the White House itself. The foundation had been carefully constructed, but its ultimate strength would only be tested when the Bush family attempted to build the political dynasty that their Nazi-derived wealth had made possible. Chapter 7. Political Rise. The 1960s marked the beginning of the Bush family's systematic conquest of American political power, fueled by wealth that traced back to Nazi Germany, but now appeared to be the product of legitimate American business success. George H.W. Bush's entry into politics represented more than just personal ambition. It was the culmination of a carefully planned family strategy to convert Nazi-derived wealth into generational political power. When Bush ran for the U.S. House of Representatives from Houston in 1966, he brought to his campaign not just his own oil industry success, but the accumulated financial and political resources that his family had been building for more than 2 decades. The campaign itself revealed how thoroughly the Bush family had laundered their controversial wealth origins. Bush's financial disclosure forms listed his assets as coming primarily from his Texas oil operations and related investments, with additional support from family trusts and investment partnerships that appeared to be standard wealth management vehicles for successful American business families. What the disclosure forms didn't reveal was how those family trusts and investment partnerships had been funded. The money that supported Bush's political career traced back to Union Banking Corporation, Brown Brothers Harriman, and the other Nazi-connected business operations that had generated exceptional profits for Prescott Bush throughout the 1930s and 1940s. But those connections were hidden behind layers of financial complexity that made them nearly impossible for journalists or political opponents to discover. Bush's successful election to Congress in 1966 marked a crucial test of the family's ability to withstand political scrutiny without having their Nazi connections exposed. Congressional candidates face extensive background investigations, opposition research, and media coverage that can reveal controversial aspects of their personal and family history. The fact that Bush's Nazi-connected family wealth remained hidden throughout this process demonstrated the effectiveness of the protective measures that the family had developed over the previous 2 decades. But Bush's congressional service also provided new opportunities to leverage his family's wealth for political advancement. As a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, Bush had influence over tax policies that could significantly benefit wealthy families like his own. His position allowed him to build relationships with other wealthy Republican donors who shared similar interests in policies that would protect and enhance their accumulated wealth. More importantly, Bush's congressional service provided him with the credentials and connections needed to pursue higher political offices that could provide even greater opportunities for advancing his family's interests. Throughout his 2 terms in the House, Bush was systematically building the political network that would support his eventual campaigns for senator, CIA director, vice president, and ultimately president. This political advancement required substantial ongoing financial investment that could only be sustained by families with access to extraordinary wealth. Campaign costs, political contributions to other Republican candidates, lobbying activities, and social events that were essential for building political relationships demanded millions of dollars in expenditures that wouldn't generate immediate financial returns. The Bush family's Nazi-derived wealth provided exactly the kind of financial foundation needed for sustained political investment over multiple decades. Money that had originally been generated through business relationships with Fritz Thyssen and other Nazi industrialists was now funding the political activities that would eventually put 2 Bush family members in the White House. Bush's unsuccessful Senate campaign in 1970 provided another crucial test of the family's ability to protect their controversial wealth origins from public exposure. Senate races attract more intensive media coverage and opposition research than House campaigns, creating additional opportunities for investigative journalists to discover damaging information about candidates' backgrounds. The fact that Bush's Nazi connections remained hidden throughout the 1970 Senate campaign demonstrated that the family's protective measures could withstand even sophisticated political investigations. Opposition researchers, investigative journalists, and Democratic Party operatives who had strong incentives to discover damaging information about Bush were unable to penetrate the complex financial structures that concealed his family's wealth origins. Bush's appointment as CIA director in 1976 represented perhaps the most significant test of the family's protective strategies. CIA directors undergo some of the most extensive background investigations in American government, including detailed analysis of their financial history, international business relationships, and potential vulnerabilities to foreign influence. The fact that Bush successfully completed the CIA confirmation process without having his father's Nazi business connections exposed revealed either that the Bush family's protective measures were extraordinarily effective or that government investigators were unwilling to pursue evidence that could have embarrassing consequences for prominent Republican political figures. Bush's CIA service also provided him with access to classified information about how government intelligence agencies investigate and track international financial relationships. This knowledge would have been invaluable for understanding potential vulnerabilities in the family's wealth protection strategies and for developing additional measures to prevent unwanted government or media investigations. More importantly, Bush's CIA position provided him with extensive networks of relationships throughout the American intelligence and national security communities. These relationships would prove crucial for protecting the family's interests as they pursued higher political offices that would subject them to even more intensive scrutiny. The systematic nature of the Bush family's political advancement throughout the 1970s reflected careful long-term planning that extended far beyond immediate electoral considerations. Rather than simply pursuing political offices that were immediately available, the family was building the kind of comprehensive political foundation that could support multiple family members' eventual campaigns for major national offices. This strategy required coordination between different family members who were pursuing political careers in different states and at different levels of government. George H.W. Bush's national political activities needed to complement and support the political ambitions of his son George W. Bush, who was beginning his own business career in Texas with obvious political objectives. The financial resources needed to sustain this multi-generational political strategy were enormous, supporting multiple family members' political activities, maintaining extensive political networks, and funding the kind of long-term political development that could lead to presidential campaigns required access to wealth that far exceeded what most American families could generate through legitimate business activities. The Bush family's Nazi-derived wealth provided exactly the kind of extraordinary financial resources needed for sustained multi-generational political investment. Money that had originally been generated through business relationships with Nazi industrialists was now funding political activities that were designed to establish the Bush family as a dominant force in American politics for decades to come. Bush's selection as Ronald Reagan's running mate in 1980 represented the culmination of more than 2 decades of systematic political development funded by Nazi-derived wealth. The vice presidency provided Bush with the platform needed to build the national political profile that would support his own presidential campaign in 1988. But the 1980 campaign also represented the most intensive scrutiny that the Bush family had ever faced. Presidential campaigns attract unprecedented media coverage, opposition research, and public attention that can reveal even carefully concealed aspects of candidates' backgrounds. The fact that Bush's Nazi connections remained hidden throughout the 1980 and 1988 presidential campaigns demonstrated that the family's protective measures had been successful in concealing their controversial wealth origins for more than 4 decades. Money that had been generated through business relationships with Hitler's supporters was now funding the political activities that put Bush in the White House. Bush's presidency from 1989 to 1993 provided the ultimate validation of the family's strategy for converting Nazi-derived wealth into American political power. A family that had built their fortune through business relationships with Nazi Germany had successfully placed one of their own members in the most powerful political position in the world. But the Bush presidency also created new vulnerabilities for the family's wealth protection strategies. Presidential activities are subject to unprecedented scrutiny from journalists, congressional investigators, and foreign intelligence services that have strong incentives to discover damaging information about American political leaders. The challenge for the Bush family was maintaining protection of their Nazi-connected wealth origins, while one of their members served in a position that subjected the entire family to extraordinary public attention. The financial structures and information control measures that had protected the family's secrets for decades would face their ultimate test during Bush's presidency and his son's subsequent political career. The question wasn't whether the Bush family had successfully laundered their Nazi-derived wealth into American political power. Their success in reaching the White House proved that they had. The question was whether their protective measures could continue concealing the true origins of their wealth as they attempted to establish a genuine political dynasty that could maintain power for generations to come. The foundation built on Nazi profits had carried the Bush family to the pinnacle of American political power. But the ultimate test of their historical deception was yet to come. Chapter 8. Modern Legacy Today. As the Bush family maintains their position among America's most influential political dynasties, the Nazi-derived wealth that launched their rise to power continues to shape American politics in ways that most citizens never imagine. George W. Bush's presidency, from 2001 to 2009, represented the ultimate success of his grandfather's strategy to convert Nazi profits into generational American political power. A family that had built their fortune through business relationships with Hitler's regime had now placed 2 of their members in the White House, controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in assets, and influenced American policy decisions that affected the entire world. But the 43rd president's time in office also revealed how thoroughly the Bush family had succeeded in concealing their controversial origins from public awareness. Throughout 8 years of intense media coverage, congressional investigations, and political opposition research, George W. Bush's Nazi-connected family wealth remained almost entirely hidden from public view. The few journalists and researchers who attempted to investigate Bush family business history found themselves confronting the same protective measures that had been shielding the family's secrets for more than 6 decades. Corporate records that could document Prescott Bush's Nazi connections remained sealed in private archives or had been destroyed entirely. Government documents that might reveal details about the family's wartime business activities were classified or heavily redacted in ways that made meaningful research nearly impossible. More importantly, the mainstream American media showed little interest in pursuing investigations that could reveal uncomfortable truths about one of the country's most prominent political families. Publishers and editors who depended on access to powerful Republican political figures had strong incentives to avoid topics that could damage their relationships with Bush family members and their extensive network of political allies. This systematic suppression of historical investigation wasn't accidental. It was the result of decades of careful cultivation of media relationships, political alliances, and legal structures that were designed to protect the Bush family from unwanted scrutiny of their business background. The same Nazi-derived wealth that had funded their political rise also provided the resources needed to maintain sophisticated information control measures that could prevent serious investigation of their controversial origins. The effectiveness of these protective measures can be measured by how little most Americans know about the Bush family's Nazi connections, despite the fact that extensive government documentation of those connections exists in federal archives. FBI files, congressional investigation records, and federal court documents provide detailed evidence of Prescott Bush's business relationships with Nazi Germany, but this evidence remains largely unknown to the general public. Contemporary political coverage of the Bush family typically focuses on their legitimate political achievements, their oil industry success, and their role in shaping modern Republican politics. Journalists who mention the family's business background usually emphasize their traditional American entrepreneurial narrative, rather than examining the complex international financial relationships that actually generated their wealth. This sanitized version of Bush family history has become so thoroughly established that even sophisticated political analysts rarely question the official narrative about how the family accumulated the substantial wealth that funded their political activities. The transformation from Nazi collaborator to American political dynasty has been so successful that the original sources of Bush family wealth have been essentially erased from mainstream historical awareness. But the influence of Nazi-derived wealth on American politics extends far beyond just the Bush family's own political careers. The financial resources that trace back to Prescott Bush's Nazi business connections have been used to support hundreds of other Republican political candidates, conservative think tanks, and policy organizations that have shaped American political development over the past several decades. Money that was originally generated through business relationships with Fritz Thyssen and other Nazi industrialists has been systematically invested in building the kind of comprehensive conservative political infrastructure that now dominates Republican politics. Campaign contributions, lobbying activities, policy research, and media operations that advance conservative political objectives have all been funded, at least in part, by wealth that traces back to Nazi business operations. The scope of this influence is staggering when viewed in historical perspective. Decisions made in 1930s Berlin by Nazi industrial planners have had ongoing consequences for American political development through the 21st century. Business relationships that were established between American financiers and Nazi supporters have continued generating political influence that affects contemporary American policy decisions. This ongoing Nazi influence on American politics operates through mechanisms that are almost entirely invisible to public awareness. The complex financial structures that were originally designed to conceal Prescott Bush's Nazi business connections have evolved into sophisticated wealth management systems that continue providing political resources for conservative causes while maintaining complete separation from their controversial historical origins. Modern Bush family political activities are funded through family foundations, investment partnerships, and related financial structures that appear to be standard wealth management vehicles for successful American business families. These structures provide ongoing access to substantial financial resources without creating obvious connections to the Nazi business operations that originally generated that wealth. But the most significant aspect of the Bush family's modern legacy involves their success in establishing a template that other wealthy American families have used to convert controversial wealth origins into legitimate political influence. The protective measures, financial structures, and information control strategies that the Bush family developed to conceal their Nazi connections have been adapted and replicated by other wealthy families who faced similar challenges in laundering morally problematic wealth into respectable American political capital. This template has particular relevance for understanding how other American families with controversial business backgrounds have successfully entered politics despite their potentially damaging wealth origins. The strategies that allowed the Bush family to conceal their Nazi connections provide a roadmap for concealing other types of controversial business relationships that could be politically damaging if exposed to public scrutiny. The systematic nature of this wealth laundering process reflects broader patterns in how American political power operates in practice rather than in theory. Wealthy families who can afford sophisticated financial planning, legal representation, and information control measures can often successfully conceal the true origins of their political influence, while families without such resources remain vulnerable to exposure and criticism. These disparities in access to wealth protection strategies have significant implications for democratic accountability in American politics. When voters lack accurate information about the true sources of their political leaders' wealth and influence, they cannot make informed decisions about whether those leaders represent their interests or serve agenda that conflicts with their values. The Bush family's success in concealing their Nazi connections demonstrates how effectively wealthy families can manipulate information about their backgrounds to present themselves as legitimate representatives of American values, even when their wealth origins directly contradict those values. This manipulation isn't just a historical curiosity, it represents an ongoing threat to democratic governance that affects contemporary American politics. Current Bush family members continue benefiting from wealth and political influence that traces back to their grandfather's Nazi business connections, but they do so through financial and political structures that make those connections nearly impossible for ordinary citizens to discover or understand. The same protective measures that concealed Prescott Bush's wartime activities continue protecting his descendants from accountability for their family's historical choices. More broadly, the Bush family's successful transformation from Nazi collaborators to American political dynasty lights fundamental weaknesses in how American political systems handle questions of wealth origins and historical accountability. The mechanisms that should prevent families with morally compromised wealth backgrounds from achieving political power have proven inadequate when confronted with sophisticated wealth laundering strategies developed over multiple decades. These systemic weaknesses have implications that extend far beyond just the Bush family's particular situation. If families can successfully launder Nazi-derived wealth into American political influence, they can presumably launder other types of morally problematic wealth through similar mechanisms. The precedent established by Bush family success provides a template that other wealthy families can follow when they face questions about their own controversial business backgrounds. The ultimate significance of the Bush family's Nazi connections lies not just in their particular historical choices, but in what those choices reveal about how American political power actually operates when wealthy families have access to sophisticated protective measures that can conceal inconvenient truths about their backgrounds. As American politics becomes increasingly dominated by wealthy families and individuals whose vast financial resources allow them to exercise disproportionate political influence, understanding how those resources were accumulated becomes crucial for maintaining democratic accountability. The Bush family's success in concealing their Nazi-derived wealth demonstrates how difficult such accountability can be to achieve when protective measures are sufficiently sophisticated and well-funded. The Nazi profits that launched the Bush political dynasty continue influencing American politics today, but they do so through mechanisms that remain largely invisible to the American public that lives with the consequences of decisions made possible by that influence. So we've seen how a single American businessman's decision to prioritize profits over principles in the 1930s created ripple effects that continue shaping American politics nearly a century later. The story of Prescott Bush's Nazi connections isn't just about one family's controversial business choices. It's about how wealth accumulated through morally compromised means can be successfully laundered into legitimate political power when sufficient resources are devoted to concealing inconvenient historical truths. Today, more than 80 years after Prescott Bush first began doing business with Nazi-connected companies, the financial and political empire built on those relationships continues influencing American political development in ways that most citizens never imagine. The Bush family's ongoing political prominence, their extensive network of political alliances, and their substantial wealth that enables ongoing political activities all trace back, at least in part, to business relationships that directly supported Hitler's regime during its rise to power. This transformation represents one of the most successful examples of historical laundering in American political history. A fortune built on Nazi profits has been systematically converted into American political capital through sophisticated financial structures, careful information control, and decades of patient political development that has made the Bush family one of the most influential political dynasties in American history. But the success of this transformation also reveals troubling weaknesses in American democratic systems that are supposed to provide accountability for political leaders whose backgrounds include morally problematic activities. The mechanisms that should prevent families with controversial wealth origins from achieving political power have proven inadequate when confronted with sophisticated protective measures developed over multiple decades. The Bush family's experience demonstrates how effectively wealthy families can manipulate information about their backgrounds to present themselves as legitimate representatives of American values, even when their wealth origins directly contradict those values. This manipulation isn't just a historical curiosity, it represents an ongoing challenge for democratic governance that affects how American political power is distributed and exercised. When voters lack accurate information about the true sources of their political leaders' wealth and influence, they cannot make informed decisions about whether those leaders actually represent their interests or serve agendas that conflict with their fundamental values. The Bush family's success in concealing their Nazi connections has denied American voters the information they would need to make such informed decisions about the family's fitness for political leadership. More broadly, the Bush family's story illustrates how historical events that Americans prefer to forget can continue influencing contemporary politics through mechanisms that operate largely beneath public awareness. The Nazi regime, that most Americans remember as a historical evil that was defeated by American military intervention, actually established business relationships with American financiers that continue generating political influence in contemporary American politics. These ongoing connections between Nazi-era business activities and modern American political power operate through complex financial and legal structures that make them nearly impossible for ordinary citizens to discover or understand. The same protective measures that originally concealed Prescott Bush's wartime business activities continue protecting his descendants from accountability for their family's historical choices. The implications extend far beyond just the Bush family's particular situation. If Nazi-derived wealth can be successfully laundered into American political influence, then other types of morally problematic wealth can presumably be laundered through similar mechanisms. The precedent established by Bush family success provides a template that other wealthy families can follow when they face questions about their own controversial business backgrounds. This template has particular relevance for understanding how modern American politics handles questions about wealth origins and historical accountability. Wealthy families who can afford sophisticated financial planning, legal representation, and information control measures can often successfully conceal the true origins of their political influence, while families without such resources remain vulnerable to exposure and criticism. These disparities in access to wealth protection strategies have significant implications for democratic equality in American politics. Political power increasingly flows to families and individuals whose vast financial resources allow them to exercise disproportionate influence over policy decisions that affect all American citizens. But the sources of those resources often remain hidden from public view. The Bush family's Nazi connections represent just one example of how controversial wealth origins can be successfully concealed through sophisticated protective measures. But their success demonstrates the broader challenges that American democratic systems face when wealthy families have sufficient resources to manipulate information about their backgrounds. Whether we like it or not, the reality is that American politics is substantially influenced by families whose wealth origins include activities that most Americans would find morally objectionable if they were aware of the true historical facts. The protective measures that conceal these uncomfortable truths operate so effectively that most American voters remain unaware of information that could significantly influence their political decisions. The Bush family's transformation from Nazi collaborators to American political dynasty represents both a remarkable individual achievement and a systemic failure of democratic accountability mechanisms. Their success in concealing their controversial origins while achieving extraordinary political influence demonstrates that American political systems are inadequately equipped to handle questions about wealth origins when sufficient resources are devoted to information control and historical manipulation. Understanding this reality doesn't require accepting it as inevitable or desirable. The Bush family's success in laundering Nazi-derived wealth into American political power represents a challenge to democratic governance that demands serious attention from citizens who value accountability and transparency in political leadership. The question isn't whether wealthy families should be permitted to participate in American politics. Democratic systems depend on broad participation that includes citizens with diverse economic backgrounds. The question is whether families whose wealth origins include morally compromised activities should be able to conceal those origins from voters who deserve accurate information about their political leaders' backgrounds. The Bush family's Nazi connections have remained hidden for more than 8 decades because they possessed the financial resources needed to develop and maintain sophisticated protective measures that could defeat most attempts at investigation or exposure. Their success demonstrates that money can indeed buy historical amnesia when sufficient resources are devoted to controlling information about controversial backgrounds. But money cannot eliminate the moral implications of historical choices, even when it can successfully conceal evidence of those choices from public awareness. The Nazi profits that launched the Bush political dynasty retain their moral significance regardless of how successfully that significance has been hidden from public view. So the question remains, in a democratic society that values both historical truth and political accountability, should families be permitted to convert wealth accumulated through morally compromised means into political influence that affects all citizens as long as they possess sufficient resources to conceal the true origins of that wealth? The Bush family's success in achieving exactly that transformation suggests that American democratic systems need stronger mechanisms for ensuring that political leaders cannot hide morally relevant information about their backgrounds from the voters who must decide whether to trust them with political power. Whether such mechanisms can be developed and implemented remains to be seen, but the Bush family's story demonstrates why such efforts are essential for maintaining the democratic accountability that American political systems are supposed to provide. This is exactly the kind of hidden history that mainstream media won't touch, but it's crucial for understanding how modern American politics actually works. The same protective mechanisms that allowed the Bush family to launder Nazi wealth into political power are still being used by other wealthy families to conceal their own controversial backgrounds. Hit that subscribe button if you want more investigations into the hidden connections between America's most powerful families and their carefully concealed business relationships that shaped the political landscape we live with today. These stories aren't just historical curiosities. They're essential for understanding why American politics operates so differently from what we're taught in civics classes. Next week, I'm diving into another buried scandal that will blow your mind: how the Rockefeller family's medical empire was built on suppressing traditional healing methods that threatened their pharmaceutical profits. The documents I've uncovered show a century-long campaign to destroy natural medicine that killed thousands of people while generating billions in profits for companies that are still dominating healthcare today. If you found this investigation valuable, check out my recent video about the Rothschild banking empire's role in financing both sides of major wars throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The evidence shows a pattern of conflict profiteering that makes the Bush family's Nazi connections look like small-time operations. These investigations take hundreds of hours of research through government archives, corporate records, and historical documents that most people never see. Your support through likes, shares, and subscriptions makes it possible for me to keep digging up the truth about how real political power operates behind the carefully constructed narratives that most Americans accept without question. The Bush family's transformation from Nazi collaborators to American political royalty proves that money can buy historical amnesia, but it cannot eliminate moral accountability. The more people who understand these hidden connections, the harder it becomes for powerful families to continue operating without scrutiny. Share this video with anyone who wants to understand why American politics feels so disconnected from ordinary citizens' interests. Because when you follow the money back far enough, you'll discover that some of our most respectable political leaders built their power on foundations that would shock most Americans if they knew the truth. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week for another investigation into the hidden history that shapes our modern world.